Hello, environmental science. This is Coach Powers, and this is Science with Coach Powers. And I wanted to let you know it's late in the day, and I wanted to say at late in the day, sometimes teachers go completely environmental. So I'm going to continue on with the review for Unit 1, the cycling of matter. You had a great week this week. We're going to continue having a great week by reviewing this stuff. So I am going to share, as I always try to do, a window that has your presentation. I'll try to make this at least 20 minutes or less. So, Unit 1, Cycling of Matter. As you'll see here, um, the 1.2 Cycling of Matter lesson. This is the first section because 1.1 is your study guide that's located in every unit. So that's the deal. So, what are the, you know, lessons you're going to learn out of this? Well, you have the water cycle, you have the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. So water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Technically, this is the only compound you see here, H2O. Carbon is usually associated with carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And nitrogen is, well, you'll be surprised. Nitrogen is the highest percentage of presence in our atmosphere. It's not carbon dioxide nor water, 78% of it. And actually, it's, the guarantee of it's going to be there. Unfortunately for nitrogen and its fans, it's going to be unusable unless it's fixated by a bacteria into plants from the atmosphere. Okay, so and we're going to go on into the purpose of this course or this section also is to help you understand the resources provided by the systems of Earth, the way we are dependent on those resources, and how our actions can alter those systems and resources. So we're looking at some accountability here on our part. Okay, so what are available to us on Earth? How are we dependent on those resources? And I'm sure the things go through your mind that you can think of. How our actions alter those systems and resources. So, as inhabitants of the planet Earth, we are part of a several interconnected systems. Those systems affect us, and we affect those systems. Now, you can also say in your biology days or earlier science days that your internal system as an inhabitant or a person or an organism has organs and a system and tissues and things like that, and things from the environment affect those as well. What you take in, it's the same thing as a planet. It's almost like a body. And how do we affect that body is up for grabs. The first unit focuses on how matter is cycled through the systems on Earth. The cycles of matter are biological or biogeochemicals, life, Earth, chemical. So the basically living chemical things that are chemicals that helps our Earth survive. And water is the first we're going to discuss, and the water is essential to life, the essence, as you will. You can't have life without the other things involved, of course, but that's the thing that keeps everything going usually. Now, the name is appropriate since biogeochemicals involve the cycling of chemicals through the Earth's system that are necessary for the continuation of living organisms. So, most biogeochemical cycles involve water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and we're going to look at those more closely. 78% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. 70%. In addition to water covering portions of the Earth, it is also a plays a key role in the environment and the bodies of living organisms. For this reason, the physical characteristics of water influence. Now, the cool things is they list out the key characteristics. I believe there are 8. Um, Water is a liquid over wide temperature ranges from 0 to 100 degrees Celsius, 100 being boiling point and 0 degrees Celsius being freezing point. There's some cool things that I teach marine science as well. There's some characteristics of the ocean, not the freshwater part, which freshwater is really tiny compared to how much salinity water or ocean water we have. Um, the annual mean temperature, which means the kind of the middle average temperature of our globe, um, allows for liquid water throughout the year. Okay, so we're going to have that. Now, we're going to just kind of go through this. I'm not going to really discuss this particularly. We're going to cover the key points. Very high heat of vaporization at number three here. Basically, is the amount of energy required to cause a liquid evaporating into a gas. So there's your definition of high heat of vaporization. Is going from liquid to gas. It requires a lot larger amount for a liquid water to go to a gaseous or evaporated state. It can remain a liquid form at a higher atmospheric temperature. This allows the presence of oceans, rivers, and lakes in hotter ecosystems. It's not going to just completely evaporate. Water is called in number four, water is called the universal solvent. Basically, it's a substance that dissolves compounds. And please, if anything you don't, if you get through science in high school, please remember water is the universal solvent. Okay, anything else that dissolves in water, particles that dissolve in water are called solutes. So that's an important chemistry or chemical thing. Back to this water is a good solvent. It dissolves compounds into component parts. This allows water to break down many compounds for biological processes. Um, Basically, for this reason, water is the key to cycles as well as many biological processes that occur in the organism, like us living. Liquid water has a very high, this is number five, high surface tension. Can you walk on water with the surface tension? No. Well, little bugs can. And that means there's some adhesion going on. If you ever heard of capillary action, you have like a little tiny thin tube with a little hole in between it, looks like a tiny straw. You dab it on top of a water puddle or whatever. The capillary action adheres, the water adheres to the side of that tube and it moves itself up, almost crawling like a living organism. That's how some plants and soil uses that capillary action. Five and six, I believe we have done this. Five, I kind of repeated it. That's fine. Density is a measure of the amount. So density is D equals mass time over volume. I want to include five again so you can see that. That's an important one. Density, D equals M over V. Mass, how much something weighs, how much stuff is there, divided by the volume. Now, if you have a ship that has lead pipes, if you throw a lead pipe in water, it's more dense than the water, so it sinks. So how can you build a ship out of lead or steel that sinks, and then it doesn't go underwater when it sails or floats? Because it has a volume of capacity there that the empty parts of that ship is the volume is greater than the density of the ship as a whole. Even though it has a huge mass, the volume counterparts and it cancels out the density, so the actual it will be less dense than water as a whole. Okay, so now water, if you look at this right here, less dense on top, more dense of more dense objects. However, when water solidifies, goes from a liquid to a solid, usually around 0 degrees Celsius, ice has a lower density than liquid water at the surface of the earth. Therefore, it floats on the surface of rivers and lakes and oceans as it forms, leaving liquid water below where fish and other organisms, if it didn't do that, it can continue to live. If ice were more dense than liquid water, it would sink and it pretty much fall on top of organisms and kill them, like plants. Now, we would have, if that's the case, they would have to regenerate themselves by some, happenstance, whether we do it or someone else. Seven, the ocean contains 97% of the total water on the planet, which leaves 3% as fresh water. All right. So we think we have enough drinking water, but we have to desalinate or try to if we have to replenish the fresh water sources in our environment. Now, the last one, eight, most of the fresh water is locked up in glacial and cap ice or buried deep in the ocean where it is economically unfeasible to reach it. So we can't really reach that. It's untapped. Although we're trying, we're developing companies are developing ways to dive deeper, and the ocean is a great untapped resource, maybe beneficially to our planet. We're more seeking out the moon and Venus and Mars for resources than we are for our oceans. Although I know there's a company in the North Atlantic that is developing high tech machines that can explore and mine our bottoms of the ocean, which are highly unexplored, mostly due to the you know toughness to get there. All right. Basically, it's while it seems like a very small amount, 0.003, we're talking about one estimate gives the amount of fresh water available to human use. The total amount of fresh water on the planet is about 0.003%. While this seems like a very small amount, is actually more than an adequate supply as long as a natural cycle of water is not seriously disturbed by an outside force. Well, what are those outside forces? Looking at the mean temperatures, looking at different things that could change over climate in time or certain areas. Now, your first 10 little section, not an overview, is 1.3, the water cycle. You'll see this diagram here, and there's a water cycle video that you can peruse at your own. And I don't want to have a video within a video. So that's going to be looking at this. You're going to look at the atmosphere. Let's start here. Of course, you have, well, rain or snow. That's precipitation, and ice will get up here on the mountains, and you have snow melting, and you have runoff of water back to a liquid from a solid down here to the streams and other things, and it seeps into the ground sometimes, as you see here. And then we have stream flow from the glacial melting, and it gets to the warmer climates down below in the valleys. You have some evaporation back up here. You have sublimation and desublimation, where it goes straight from a solid to a gas. That's subliming or sublimation. That's pretty much like a solid of CO2, carbon dioxide. Frozen goes completely to a gas straight when it combines with some water substance. And of course, the opposite, a gas straight to a solid. Now let's follow this path. We get into groundwater flow, and where it comes up is dependent upon the characteristics and the regular fauna. Fresh water is made in here, and you can have runoff into the ocean, of course. And we're seeing some topography on the bottom of the ocean, some vents and volcanoes, hydrothermal vents, and others. Okay, of course, the plants and things use it. And this can cause some source of stream flow. And one thing I want to mention, we're going to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus. There's some runoff that contains some excess fertilizer into the ocean. And we're going to be interrupted in a second here. I apologize. Anyway, into the ocean we go. So fresh, salty, and we're going this way. Now, we can't have some evaporation from the oceans. Okay, sorry about that. So now that's the ocean type thing. So that's going to happen sometimes. Announcements. I'm in a school. Transpiration usually goes from plant leaf the water goes through the stomata and up into the atmosphere. So evapotranspiration. There's some good definitions that you can use. I don't know if you ever heard of this one. This is fog drip. So that's a good one to look up as well. Continuing, water cycle is necessary for the continuation of all life on Earth. In the 1.3 assignment, you'll have the opportunity to look more closely at each of these processes. And usually a project comes up where you're drawing those cycles, each one of them, and labeling the parts of it. And you'll have to, usually do that on a test. This one, I don't know yet. It's being prepared. If you look at the image above, which is back here, thank you to the U.S. Department of Interior, U.S. Geological Survey, John Evans, Howard Friedman, USGS is basically that diagram. Anything that blocks or slows the cycle can alter the overall amount of water available for organisms and ecosystems. Throughout this course, we'll look at how humans can negatively impact the water cycle and therefore affect life on Earth. And hopefully we'll look at some positive effects that we're trying to do as well. The carbon cycle, probably you might be studying organic chemistry in college. The carbon cycle, or carbon, basically is that whole class. So that one element is the definition of what an organic thing is on the planet. And studied 900 pages worth of just the carbon and carbon molecules. If you see this, of course, we know that CO2 is in our atmosphere as a gas. It diffuses throughout the atmosphere and it gets into oceans as well. Now, it can fall down to calcareous sediments. All right, that usually is contained on top of coral and other types of shells and fish, or just sediment at the bottom. Aquatic biomass, that's basically living things that are masses that, can use that as far as going towards it, or, settling down after some biomass creation. Right. So then calculus goes in some creation on the or on under the crust, and some pressure, which we get to the fossils that have been made, or some types of deposits. And the lithosphere is a rock sphere, levels of the ocean. Soil, organic matter, basically, it's used to be living at one time. It still has carbon based resources within it, and more biomass is there. So you have aquatic, and we have land or terrestrial biomass. Now we have carbon dioxide, which is usually equated with photosynthesis, and we have respiration coming out of it, which is breathing of the plants, which is oxygen coming out. We do the opposite. We respire in a different way. We take some of these coal and oil resources in the lithosphere, and we can burn it as fuel. Basically, carbon, if you look over this phrase over here, carbon is the basic building block of all living organisms. Now, and water is essential to life, but we usually build substance or living organisms off of it. However, the majority of carbon is stored in organic minerals and rocks. Okay, the carbon is also stored in the oceans and the atmosphere. The carbon cycle is usually comprised of several interconnected processes. So, just like the water cycle. All right, so this is another video within the video. Okay, so this will take you through the carbon cycle in a more verbal aspect, and I'm not going to go through and uh, have you look at this through this. So how long is this for you guys? That's about 3.5 minutes. I think you can get through that. Okay, a good one. And maybe we'll watch those in the future if I don't have longer lectures. Now here you'll see in your virtual SC the carbon cycle process. You have some processes here, or definitions of a process: photosynthesis, consumption, defecation, a constant eruptions. I apologize. Respiration, decomposition, fossil fuel formation, burning of fossil fuels. Basically, fossils are dead things, or former living organisms that form these pressurized fossil fuels, and we burn those for energy. Diffusion into the ocean, so they're fusing the carbon dioxide gas into the ocean, and CO2 does affect the environment of the ocean internally to change the pH levels, and that does also affect different organisms, including living coral. In that, there's some coral bleaching. Precipitation of ocean sediment, that basically says, precipitation solidifies as carbon solidifies on the ocean floor, and we get something called a carbon sink. Carbon in this sink remains out of the carbon cycle for extended periods of time. The overall effect of precipitation of ocean sediments is a deposit into a carbon sink. Okay, so get to know that those processes of the carbon cycle. Okay, the nitrogen cycle. 1.4, it should be 5. I apologize. Some of these are mislabeled, but they used to take out some of the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles from this section. So old information. And I'm not going to take you through a lot of it, but if you look at this image, you can see how nitrogen is cycled through the systems. Anything that consumes and holds nitrogen is considered a reservoir. So you have a carbon sink and we have a nitrogen reservoir. I don't know why they don't distinguish, but basically, um, it's similar to a carbon sink. So there's similarities to it. It acts differently than carbon dioxide. And as I said before, you're looking at the highest levels in the atmosphere of any element or molecule, which is nitrogen. Okay. So The big things I want to point out, of course, you have cycles through here that stay in the soil. You have cycles that denitrify from bacteria, and I'll talk about that. Human activities will force nitrogen in or use or drop nitrogen into the soils for fertilization purposes for grass and other things. We have nitrification or fixation. We have denitrification. So denitrification is going from bottom to top, usually from the soil or ocean. When it gets into the ocean, we have this cycling here. Okay. And phytoplankton being one of those things that will fixate into the fish. And we have decomposers that will take those fish and recycle that as well as waste. And this coffee sip was brought to you by the people that made this coffee. It consists of beans from Hawaii and Colombia, and it tastes just like coffee. All right. So get to know these words. Biotic means living stuff, and abiotic, like rocks. Don't say trees; those are living. Cars is abiotic, so we put an A in front of the biotic, and some of you guys know that. Nitrogen are important in this process because plants need nitrogen to fertilize the internal plants to help them grow. Bacteria are essential to fixate the nitrogen into a plant through the soil by nodules on the plant's roots that go into the plant and help it grow. Now, as we know, a lot of corporations near waterways like to fertilize their grass or use it for certain things. Well, once that gets into the ground, it sometimes runs off into the ocean. We get these things called algal blooms. Um, and you'll notice there's different names of bacteria here. I like cyanobacteria. They look blue-ish. That's what cyan means for blue. 1.5, the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a third necessary element um, for the continuation of all life on Earth. Nitrogen is very important. Making sure my mute isn't on. Good. Um, Basically, it's also important for the structure of proteins and nucleic acids. Now, as you know, DNA and RNA are essential to the creation of proteins from the nucleus of a cell into a transcription into RNA, translation into a protein. Okay, so it makes us, living things what they are. Throughout this course, we'll look at how humans can negatively impact the nitrogen cycle and how increased levels of nitrogen in the atmosphere may impact organisms. The last thing, dun, 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 the phosphorus cycle. Okay. The phosphorus cycle. So we have, you might not have heard of a lot of cycles using phosphorus. Um, Animal tissues and feces are the most biggest created phosphate type recycling. All right. Once we have that, it goes into decomposition by the fungi and bacteria. Fungi or fungi is fine with me if you pronounce it that way. Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. Phosphates in the soil, they get put there by decomposition. They can assimilate by plant cells, assimilation by the plant cells into that. And that also helps fertilize or help the health of plants. We also have the weathering or breakdown of rock, which has some phosphate content. Incorporating into sedimentary rock, it uplifts in this rock into terrestrial environments, which you're seeing here on top of the surface, or the earth is in terrestrial. We lose some in drainage into the ocean, and then it can come back into this area. So we're talking about cycles here. And we look at the type of cycles we have. We have cycles within the cycles and around the cycles that cycles around. Okay, talking about this, phosphorus is the final element that we'll study. And phosphorus is necessary for the structure of cell membranes. Remember the phospholipid bilayer in cells, the structure of DNA and RNA, and the structure of ATP, the primary energy carrying molecule used by most living organisms. Nitrogenous bases, amino acids, these all contain some phosphorus and nitrogen in them. Okay. No, sorry. Yes. The phospholipid bilayer. I apologize. There's a phosphate group and things in those that were mentioned. There is not a separate assignment, I'm sorry, for the phosphorus cycle because The overall cycle is relatively simple compared to the other cycles of matter. Phosphorus is not found in abundance in the atmosphere. Now, it does result in these processes. So, what they're saying is it's not big enough really to have its own section and assignment attached to it. But you still need to know these things. Most phosphorus occurs in rocks or in ocean sediments. When phosphate-bearing rock is weathered, the phosphate is dissolved and ends up in rivers, lakes, and soils. Plants take up phosphate from the soil, while animals ingest phosphorus by eating plants. Phosphate is returned to the soil, okay, via the decomposition of animal waste or plant and animal materials. Some phosphorus is washed to the oceans where it eventually finds its way into the ocean floor sediments. This cycle repeats itself again. That's why I call it a cycle. It repeats itself again and again. All right. Thanks to the Bitmoji folks, the Fort Mill School District 4, the Catawba High School YouTube, Smithsonian NOAA, and the Coldplay instrumental for this introduction is provided by the song Yellow, artist Coldplay, album Yellow, writers a world champion Chris Martin, John Buckland, Guy Berryman, licensed by YouTube by WMG on behalf of PLG UK Frontline, and so on and so forth. Guys, thank you for all those contributions and donations to this program, making education fun. And saying that, I'm going to stop sharing and say goodbye to you all. Have a good time reviewing for the test. If you need help, please let me know. If you're having trouble with the discussion, I did post something up in the discussion to help you along. Guys, live simply, love generously, and care deeply.